I always thought divorce was a tragedy, but it ended up being a liberation for me. When I finally moved out of our cozy apartment in downtown Boston and into a small house in the suburbs, it was a step into the unknown. Everything was a stranger here. Neighbors greeted me with smiles, but there was a slight suspicion in their eyes. "She's alone," they said with their gazes. For 2 weeks, I enjoyed the silence. No one argued over unwashed dishes. No one made me listen to ESPN at maximum volume. I bought myself flowers, drank wine with Netflix, and even tried to meditate. But loneliness is a strange thing. It's relaxing at first, and then it gets sticky like a spider's web. When my sister Jessica called and asked me to babysit her son Ryan for a couple weeks, I said yes, without hesitation. "Emily, it's just for a little while George and I sort out, well, a few things," she began evasively. "Ryan's almost an adult. He won't cause any problems." Her voice sounded so strained that I didn't question it. Almost grown up turned out to be a 16-year-old in an overly long hoodie and sneakers that cost more than my monthly paycheck. "Hi, Aunt Emily," he said, throwing his backpack in the hallway. "Hi, Ryan. Make yourself at home," I replied, trying to smile. Within half an hour, he had already locked himself in his room with his laptop. I figured teenagers were all like that, keeping to themselves. And frankly, I was okay with that. The first night went smoothly. I warmed up a pizza and offered him dinner, but he declined, saying he wasn't hungry. There were quiet voices and keyboard clicks coming from his room. Games, I guessed, or TikTok. Later, I went in to ask if he was okay. The door was ajar, but when I knocked, he slammed it shut sharply. "He's hiding something," my mind flashed. The next day, Ryan remained just as quiet. He hardly ever left the room, and when he did, he looked at me strangely. Not defiant, no. I chalked it up to the fact that we just didn't know each other very well. But after a couple days, I started to notice something unusual. One evening, I was standing in front of my bedroom mirror, changing after a shower. The window faced the street, but the curtains were drawn. Suddenly, I felt that someone was watching. I turned around, and there was no one. My heart raced. I reassured myself that it was just my imagination, but the feeling didn't leave me. Ryan started showing up in places I didn't expect him to be. He'd peek out of his room as I walked by in my pajamas, or he'd show up in the kitchen as I was washing dishes in my short shorts. He must be bored, I thought. But everything changed one Saturday. Saturday was my day of relaxation. Cleaning up, a glass of wine, a bubble bath, a ritual that helped me escape reality just a little bit. Ryan was sitting in his room, as always. I seemed to be alone in the house. I put on my favorite silk pajamas and took a glass of wine into the bedroom. My laptop was on the table, and I decided to watch another episode of my show. It had been a long day, and I felt like I deserved some fun. But in all the relaxing activities, I completely forgot to check the door. It was unlocked. For a while, I was completely absorbed in my occupation, oblivious to everything around me. But then a strange feeling came over me, like I was being watched. You know how it is? When the air in the room seems to get thicker, and every rustle seems louder. I turned around and saw Ryan. He was standing in the doorway. For a moment, our gazes met. His eyes were widened, his face flushed with paint. He mumbled something, and without waiting for a response, disappeared out the door like a shadow. I sat there as if paralyzed. My heart was pounding. and the only thought in my head was, he saw everything. After a few minutes, I left the room. Ryan had locked himself in his room. I knocked, but he didn't answer. It was hard to tell what exactly I wanted to hear from him. An apology? An explanation? Or did I just need to make sure he understood how unacceptable this was? Back to my room, I tried to distract myself, but the feeling of awkwardness was eating me up inside. The next morning, Ryan was still avoiding me the same way. He didn't come down for breakfast, and didn't even leave the room until noon. I knew we couldn't just ignore what had happened, but how to start a conversation. Okay, Emily, you're an adult. We need to talk, I decided, working up the courage to do so. The next morning, I didn't bother to procrastinate. Ryan was avoiding me, but I had already decided that I needed to set things straight. Besides, this was my house, my rules, and I wasn't about to let an incident like this ruin what was left of my comfort. I knocked on the door of his room. Ryan, we need to talk. At first, there was silence. Then there was a heavy sigh. The door opened, and he peeked out, like he was afraid I'd yell at him. Can I come in? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, looked away, and sat on the bed with his hands in the pockets of his hoodie. I sat across from him, in the chair by his desk. Look, I started, gathering my thoughts. I understand that being a teenager isn't easy. You grow up, you have interests, questions. But what happened yesterday? I paused, trying to find the words. It wasn't normal. He stared at the floor. I didn't mean to, Ryan mumbled. But you did, I interrupted. Do you realize that everyone should have their own space? Especially a woman. He hesitated, then looked up, embarrassed and ashamed. I don't know. It came out by accident. I didn't believe him. I saw him open the door, saw what was going on, and didn't leave. But I didn't want to back him into a corner. Instead, I decided to soften my tone. Ryan, I need you to be honest. Why did you do that? He blushed even more, looked away. A few seconds felt like an eternity. I was just curious. He finally blurted out. Well, how? You're an adult. I've never been around. He trailed off, confused by the words. That's all. I was dumbfounded. What do you mean, interesting? I thought teenagers his age got their answers to interesting from the internet, not real life. Ryan, I realize you're learning a lot right now, I said, trying to be as calm as possible. But there are boundaries, and this is about crossing them. He nodded, but he didn't look entirely convinced. I wouldn't want to involve your parents, I added, but if it happens again, I'll have to do it. Do you understand? Yes, Aunt Emily, I won't do it again, he answered quickly. That was the end of the conversation. I was relieved, but also anxious. I wanted to believe it was enough for him to understand, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was deeper than simple curiosity. That night, Ryan acted like nothing was wrong. He came down for dinner, helped clear the table, even made a joke when I accidentally dropped my spoon. Everything seemed normal, but I noticed he was avoiding looking me in the eye. I decided to step up my measures, locking the doors, checking to make sure he was in his room before doing personal business, just in case. But the calm didn't last long. A few days later, I noticed he was watching again, this time through the slightly ajar bathroom door. When I saw his gaze through the ajar bathroom door, it was like an electric shock. At first I froze, not believing it was happening again. His eyes met mine, and this time he didn't run away. Instead, he quickly averted his gaze and disappeared around the corner. My anger was instantaneous. I stepped out of the bathroom, wrapped myself in a towel, and headed straight for his room. Without even knocking, I swung the door open sharply. Ryan! This was getting out of hand. He was sitting on the bed, his face white as chalk. I didn't, he started, but I interrupted him. Don't you dare say you didn't want to. This is the second time. You stood there and watched. I took a step closer so he could feel the seriousness of what I was saying. It's not accidental. It's not curiosity. Do you realize that this is completely unacceptable? Ryan lowered his head. His shoulders slumped. He looked depressed, but I couldn't stop myself. You have no right to violate my boundaries. You know it's wrong, and I'm not going to pretend it's some teenage stupidity anymore. He didn't say anything back. I expected at least an apology, but instead he just sat there as if the whole world had collapsed on him. I'm calling your mom, I said firmly, turning toward the door. No, he shrieked. Please, Aunt Emily, don't. His voice shook, and I froze. For the first time I could hear the fear in it, but also the desperation. Why shouldn't I do this, Ryan? Give me at least one reason. He stopped talking. He seemed to be struggling with something inside of him. Finally, he said, because Mom's mad at me as it is. She and Dad say I'm a problem. I don't want to cause more trouble. I sighed, trying to control my emotions. This was getting more complicated than I'd expected. His words made me think, but that didn't change his behavior. Ryan, I know this is hard for you, I said, sitting down on the edge of his bed. But that doesn't excuse what you're doing. I can't just turn a blind eye to it. He lowered his head again, but then he said something unexpected. I don't even know why I'm doing this. It's just, you're different. Not like Mom. You're kind. You don't yell at me all the time. Those words made me feel weird. On the one hand, I understood that he was looking for warmth and attention. On the other, his ways were completely unacceptable. Ryan, I started softly. I'm glad you see something good in me, but that doesn't give you the right to act like this. If you want attention, we can talk. We can spend time together. But violating my boundaries is not a solution. He nodded, but I could see he still didn't fully understand. From now on, we're going to have strict rules, I said, standing up. All doors in the house are locked. If you want to say something, you knock, and the same goes for me. Respect is the most important thing, Ryan. He nodded again, and I left the room, feeling a mixture of anger, fatigue, and relief. But despite the conversation, there was still a restlessness inside me. That same night, I got a text from my sister. How's Ryan doing? Not giving you too much trouble, I hope. I sat with my phone in my hands, not knowing how to respond. All I wanted to do was be honest about what was going on. But I knew it would ruin the family, and Ryan seemed to be on edge. I decided not to say anything for now. After we talked, Ryan's behavior became noticeably quieter. He stopped showing up where I didn't expect to see him, spent more time in his room, and tried to avoid me. It seemed like I'd gotten what I wanted. But somehow, instead of relief, all I felt was anxiety. I thought about him more than I wanted to. His words about feeling like a problem at home stayed in my head. On the one hand, I felt sorry for him. On the other, I couldn't get over the fact that his behavior toward me was completely unacceptable. It was like a ticking bomb. I felt like something was going to go wrong anyway. A few days later, I decided to relax a little. After work, I poured myself a glass of wine, put on some music, and set out to have a little spa day. Face mask, bubble bath, just the way I like it. Ryan was in his room. Before I started, I made sure his room was locked. No surprises, I thought. I locked the bathroom door, checked the knob, and only then did I allow myself to relax a little. The water in the tub was warm, the light scent of lavender filling the room. I felt the tension begin to fade away. But after a few minutes, I heard a rustle. I froze. It was a slight, almost imperceptible sound, like someone moving behind the door. "Ryan?" I called out. Silence. I thought it might have been my imagination, but the feeling that I wasn't alone was too strong. I quickly climbed out of the tub, threw on a towel, and opened the door. The hallway was empty. I need to stop getting myself worked up, I decided. But as I passed his room, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. It was weird, because he'd always kept it shut tight before. "Ryan?" I called out again, but there was no answer. I pushed the door open and peeked inside. He was sitting on the bed, laptop on his lap. When he saw me, he abruptly slammed the lid shut. "What are you doing?" I asked, suspicion beginning to boil inside me. "Nothing, just looking at something," he mumbled, avoiding my gaze. "Watching what?" "Serial," he mumbled. "Aunt Emily, it's fine." But his behavior gave him away. Something was wrong. I went to my room, but I felt uneasy all evening. The way he slammed the laptop shut, the look of guilt in his eyes, it all made me think Ryan had overstepped his bounds again. During the night, I couldn't sleep. I decided I would talk to him again in the morning, this time seriously. But in the morning, everything changed. I woke up to a knock on the door. It was Ryan. "Aunt Emily, can I talk to you?" His voice sounded strange. It was confused, almost scared. "Sure, come on in," I answered, not yet realizing what was waiting for me. He came into the room, sat on the edge of the bed, and began to fumble with the sleeve of his hoodie. "I want to apologize for everything. For what I did. For peeking. I don't know what came over me." His voice shook. It wasn't like it was just a duty apology. I'm confused. I'm so lonely. Mom and Dad just fight. They're always busy, and it's like nobody wants me." Those words hit me. He was being honest, and I could see in his eyes that he was struggling with himself. "Ryan, I understand that this is hard for you," I replied. "But your actions are still unacceptable. You have to respect the people around you, even if you feel bad." He nodded, looking at the floor. "I'll try to make it up to you. I just don't want to be like this." I reached out and squeezed his palm gently. "I'll help you, Ryan, but only if you promise that you'll be honest with me and that you won't violate my boundaries again." "I promise," he whispered. In that moment, I felt like we were finally on the same page. His demeanor changed, and for the first time I saw him not as a weird teenager, but as a confused kid who needed help. After our conversation, things started to change. Ryan really started to try harder. He became more open, even offering to help me around the house. It was unexpected, but nice. I tried to show him that I appreciated his efforts. His behavior no longer caused me anxiety. Ryan started acting like a normal teenager, disappearing into his room with games and TV shows, sometimes complaining about being bored, and sometimes asking weird questions that might have been funny if it weren't for the context. But I was still wary. One night, at dinner, he suddenly asked, "Have you ever been angry with your parents?" "Sure," I replied, trying to figure out where he was going with this. "When I was a teenager, they didn't seem to understand me at all." He nodded, looking at the fork in his plate. "My mom always says that I ruin everything, that I'm the reason she and Dad are fighting." I put my fork down, feeling my insides clench. "Ryan, that's not true. What happens between your parents is their business, not yours. You're not responsible for it." He looked at me gratefully, but didn't say anything. From that day on, I tried to talk to him more. We watched movies together, cooked dinner together, and sometimes we just sat in the kitchen with mugs of tea, discussing something insignificant. I noticed that Ryan was slowly relaxing, but one day he asked, "Are you still mad at me?" The question caught me off guard. "No," I answered honestly, "but I want you to understand that your actions were unacceptable. I was angry at the time, but I can see now that you understand why it was wrong." "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not telling my mom." My sister called a week later. "How's he doing? He's acting normal, I hope?" I smiled as I watched Ryan lay out the cards on the table for another game of fool's game I'd taught him. "He's great, Jess," I replied. Ryan smiled when he heard my answer, and there was a look of gratitude in his eyes.